I would like to introduce Xuanyi. He's also goes by Maxwell. And it is really my pleasure to invite him for today's speaker. And this lecture is part of AR5959D Made in Singapore 2. We are dealing with a lot of using AI tools and computational tools to look at starting from the urban context. Now we're looking at into assemblages in Singapore. And we have these lecture series set up so that we can actually dive into different topics that dealing with AI. And so it's not specifically geared towards our class, but it also opens up our exposure to using AI tools for our students and also from outsiders. And Xuanyi is an assistant professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning and a faculty affiliate of the Asia Research Institute at the University of Buffalo. His research investigates how social infrastructures reshape spatial orders and everyday life in cities across China, the United States, and Southeast Asia. Uh, Maxwell focused on two domains, the role of healthcare infrastructure, such as large hospitals and retirement communities, and as territorial actors that transform urban neighborhoods and spatial hierarchies, and the potential of civic infrastructures, including neighborhood institutions, green spaces, and public meetings to be democratized in ways that foster inclusion and equity. He serves as the international corresponding editor for urban studies and actively develops community partnerships, including collaborations with New York Botanics in Rochester and Kampungs in Jakarta, Indonesia. Before joining University of Buffalo, Xuanyi was a postdoctoral research at the Harvard School of Public Health and taught at the National University of Singapore, Roger Williams University, and Harvard GSD. And he also practiced architecture and urban design and worked with UN Habitat on planning consultancy in developing countries. Please join me in welcoming Xuanyi. And whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Professor Kim, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about some of my ongoing projects with AI. And just a side note for everybody here. Professor Kim and I were classmates back in the GSD. So it feels like a deja vu. Just having having Fred there inviting me over for this lecture. Anyway, not so much about the emotional talks. I'll just move into the presentation today. So, Professor Kim has done a great job introducing my research because on my poster, the guy saw the image of me and doing some research in Kanpun. And I just think I would like to, clarify a little bit on how that is related to my research. So this diagram shows that my overarching focus in my research is social infrastructures and how that reshapes spatial justice and everyday life, urban everyday life. And that's done through two channels. One is healthcare infrastructures. It's, for example, hospitals and care providers. The other pathway is through civic infrastructures, basically place, space, and sociality. And today's talk is more revolving around civic infrastructures. I'm just going to tell a little bit more context of my connections with Southeast Asia and Singapore. So these are two more pictures of me doing some field work in Kampung Kalibata in South Jakarta. So I believe this photo was taken in July 2024. It's already a year before. It's already 1.5 years ago. And we were doing community engagement studies with women and men leaders in the Kampung to learn about their social and spatial aspirations in the kampuns. And beyond that, I'm also doing some work in Singapore. So these are pictures showing some of the green space studies, specifically sky gardens in Singapore that I'm doing. So I'm looking at the spatial characteristics and also social exclusionary practices in these sky gardens. So let me move my screen. So that's about my background. I would like to give you guys a question before we start the talk, just to lay the foundation for the logics for today's discussion. What is urban? What is urban made of? Right. Too bad I'm doing that virtually. Otherwise, it'd be nice to ask your questions and get your answers. So, usually, when we talk about urban, we think about what? Physical constructions, cities, built environment, right? So, how that is done? Through infrastructural provision. And what does infrastructure do? If you are a geographer, you certainly will think about how is resources extracted and being consumed from place to place. And then the construction and urban development at a place is certainly accompanied with resource extraction on the other end of the space. And that is done through infrastructure and the infrastructural providers. So this is usually categorized as one of the major urban movements when we think about what is urban. But this is not just it, right? Because urban is not just an encompassing entity of physical forms. It also has not intangible. It also has a governance aspect of it when we think about the built space. Because the built space is what we experience as human beings, but there are other systems, regulatory systems to be specific, that governs the production of space. What are those? Firstly, we'll think about institutions. What are these? The governments, corporations, planning boards, these are all important institutions. And what do they produce? They produce laws, for example, zoning laws, and plans and documents as representations of those laws. And so famous examples of those laws are the redlining in the United States at its peak in 1930s, and then was outlawed by the Fair Housing Act in the 60s. So this is a map of Buffalo showing the red lining of the neighborhoods. So where it's marked by red is marked as dangerous, because in urban development process, housing loan corporations will intentionally mark certain areas as dangerous, especially where the colored people cluster. And that will lead to disinvestment. What does disinvestment do? There'll be lack of provision of infrastructure and services. There will be decadent spaces and areas. There will be devaluation. And then once the area is devaluated, corporations will come back and buy those places and appreciate value again and kick the people who already live in there. So this is famously known as a gentrification process. Although the redlining has been outlawed, now it's illegal. Still, it's still being exercised in many implicit ways across the United States, and gentrification is a non-stopping process. So if we think about this level, there are these institutions, laws, and representations that is above the physical form that governs the urban process we experience and we see every day. But if we think deeper about those representations and laws and zoning regulations, right? So how does that affect urban everyday life is another problem for us to think about for urban. So I want to quote the famous saying by the sociologist Louis Wirth, very early in 1938. He said that urbanism as a way of life. What does a quote mean? It essentially means that cities and urban is not just a physical mega form or a singular entity, physical entity that we can imagine. It's a collection of social, cultural, psychological statuses and exchanges. It's a combination of relational processes, and that is urban. So that concept was out very early in the late 30s. And jumping to nowadays, if we expand that kind of thought, there are people saying, there are scholars, for example, Jonathan Reeds, saying that city as a text. How are they related? Think about it. If urbanism is partially about the physical environment we live in, and also about the everyday life we're experiencing. It's about people. And what are about people? People talk, people communicate, people express, and through what mediums? And that is an interesting question, right? It can be done through sentiments, for example, because people will use sentiments to communicate, to deliver thoughts, and achieve purposes. It will be done through names, for example, place names, brand names, all those names, because names convey aspirational meanings. It could also be done through neighborhood changes, represented by, uh, for example, Yelp or Google reviews, all that kind of things, which you're familiar with. It can also be represented by institutions, for example, websites or documents being stored or even being kept in the libraries. So all those forms of the urban are documented in textual formats. And beyond that, um, beyond that, not only that people and people communicate with each other, and people and institution will also have to communicate. And institution will also have to communicate. Because if we imagine the city as a grand network of different actors, and how's that done? For example, emails. It's very important because a lot of decisions were made through email chains. What are others? Public meeting transcripts, for example. On the right, I'm attaching an image of the general meeting minutes of Atlanta City Planning Commission. That was in the 1920s. Look at this. Just look at that PDF, right? It's words. But can you imagine reading like 100 pages of this kind of words? It's hard, right? It's human. It's just too fatigued for human to do that. And yet those planning documents contain a lot of information about how decisions were made and what decisions were made. So if it is hard for a human being to do this repetitive, fatiguous jobs, right, are there any alternatives that can help us do that? Lucky we're now in the 2020s, right? So we have large language models. Large language models are just made to do that. So with the assistance of AI, specifically large language models, it's just easier for us to understand those piles of documents, which contains, for human eyes, very hard to text that are very hard to be recognized. So what can we do with those public documents or textual materials? Here, I want to emphasize a bullet point. Power operates through text because planning decisions are not just technically determined. It's radically constructed. What do I mean by rhetorically constructed? For example, planning documents will deliver certain public interests, of course, because what is the audience of planning? What is the user of planning? It's the public. It will also deliver certain technical and legal vocabulary for the technical officers. It will also focus on procedural justification as for why certain decisions are made and how they are made, and to make publics buy those decisions. It also involves emotional testimony, as I said before, because when decisions are made, there will be negotiations and contestations. And when people are in fight, interesting emotional waves will start to emerge. So now we are on how power operates through text. I want to specifically discuss that with two research projects. So the first research project was published last year in planning in JPER, Journal of Planning, Education and Research. So it's on evaluating citizen participation in local public meetings in the United States, and we were using a large language model to do that through a large amount of transcripts in the United States. So these two projects really started from an overarching interest of understanding who have powers and how decisions are made in local public meetings, which is a very important venue for planning decision making in the United States. So I want to quote famous and late James Scott from his book, The Domination and the Arts of Resistance. He said that the dominant never control the stage, absolutely, but their wishes normally prevail. Now, what does that mean? It sounds like La Prince, right? But what it means is simple, right? The dominants will absolutely defend the status quo. Now, how is status quo defended? They will perform. They will perform the public interests for the public. So despite the fact that public may think there are certain public intentions being conducted here, but the eventual goal is to serve for the status quo. And that's very provocative. And that triggered me to think about, okay, and how is that represented or exercised in the institutional context of the United States? So that's the motivation for doing this project. And then related to that, if if status quo is defended in public meetings, and so do citizens actually get empowerment in those processes? And or what kind of empowerment do they actually have? So you see, I'm trying to draw a relationship between the institution and the public and how power is being exercised in this kind of dynamics. So something I like to tell about how I do research is that despite the fact that I'm using a large language model for this project, but I always do a theory-driven research because I think good use of tools is actually to solve interesting questions. So now let's think through theory, through power and how power is exercised in planning. So starting from the 60s, very famous planners, including Paul Davidoff and Norman Krumholz, started to mention that advocacy planning. What's advocacy planning? So what happened is that in the 60s, the Fed was very powerful, the legacy from the 40s. So the Fed had initiated a series of urban renewal laws and regulations. For example, Fair Housing Act was one of it. Section 8 was another, right? So they work together, allow Fed and state governments to basically take over neighborhoods for urban renewal projects. But of course, when you do urban renewal, when you do displacements, there will be contestations because people who already live in there do not want to be displaced. And citizens are often depowered in this process, and that requires advocacy. So that's why advocacy was such a thing in the 60s, and it's still in the core of urban planning, at least in the United States, till now. And later on, well, not later on, around the same time, there's another planner, Sherry Arnstein. She came up with this idea of the ladder of citizen participation, which is in photo on the right. So from the bottom, it's basically no participation. Citizens are being manipulated, therapeutic, informing, all that kind of things. And then, in the middle is degrees of tokenism. And above tokenism is reaching, citizens are reaching certain level of citizen power. And of course, on the highest thread of the ladder is citizen control. But, can we actually do that? I don't know. This is kind of an ideal situation. But something constantly revolving around this ladder is that if we think about the relationships between institutions and the public, where are the publics? Where are public's positions in this process? If we imagine a ladder like this. Okay, so then why public meetings? Because public meetings are the most common and traditional way to involve citizens in decision making in the United States. Essentially, when there are civic affairs decisions being made, usually the local governments will have a public meeting or public hearing, so the local residents can participate in those meetings to observe how decisions are made. They can also sometimes have a say in this process to voice themselves. But interesting thing is that yes, the public can voice themselves, but do the local offices listen? It's like a kid is voicing or is crying that I'm hungry for food, but does the parent actually think this is a good time to have food? So it's a different thing, right? So that leads to a question, a critique that greater inclusion or involvement does not necessarily imply greater power, because especially in the literature before the 90s, when the public involvement was low. A lot of critics were thinking, okay, we need to increase public involvement and public inclusion. We need to get more people involved in public meeting and decision-making process. But does that actually lead to greater power to citizens? That's a question. And sometimes, and most often, no, because structural power inequality exists always within participants. There are always elites who are more savvy in the political process, who are more able to defend their privileges. For example, the affluent community members. And certainly, they will exclude underrepresented groups, for example, people of color. And with power holders, for example, the governments, power is rarely conceded to shape decisions, because for any institution, the least thing they want to do is to concede their power to the public. That means the institution is being depowered, the lack of the veto right of any decisions. Okay, so how do we do this research? We're using a public available data. It's called local views, developed by two PhD students in political science at Harvard University. That data was out in 2023, so hopefully they have graduated now and up to their career trajectory. But the local view is a very powerful data set. It's called the largest existing data set of local government public meetings. How the data was constructed is that these two guys, so in the United States, some local governments, not all, most of them have video recordings of the local public meetings. And those videos were later on uploaded to YouTube. So these two folks downloaded those YouTubes, all of the YouTubes, transcribed the YouTubes into textual documents. And that's a lot. So just by the time we downloaded the data in 2024, we retrieved 6,401 public meeting transcripts across 280 US cities between the year 2006 and 2023. But of course, it's not all encompassing. For example, unfortunately, New York City is not included because New York City is an outlier. It does not publish any of its public meeting video recordings online, unfortunately. And through this more than 6,000 public meeting transcripts, we identified more than 4,000 valid non-empty transcripts held by planning and zoning boards. And because this research was done in 2004, we were using OpenAI ChatGPT 4.0 model for the large-scale text interpretation. And we were using zero-shot prompting because this was a rather exploratory work. We didn't want to have few-shot prompting which could affect the reasoning of the model itself. So how do we do the evaluation? So first, we extract those data set we extract the transcripts from the data sets, and we want to see whether citizens are empowered, right, in those public meetings. And we evaluate those public meetings through 4 dimensions on the principles of procedural equity. So in equity research, there are 3 kinds of equities. There are distributional equity, which means whether the outcomes, the decisions fairly and equitably distribute resources to different groups. And there are procedural equities, meaning that in the decision-making process, are people equitably involved? And there is also conceptual equity, which means that whether related stakeholders, for example, citizens, decision makers, government officers, do they have a fair understanding of equity? So we're focusing on procedural equity because we're looking at decision-making process. And we're looking at four dimensions. The first dimension is involvement, meaning whether participants speak up. This is like the basic. If there's a public meeting where nobody can speak up, and that's pathetic. Second level is engagement, whether participants were treated seriously beyond a single directional style. So that's beyond informing. Imagine going to a meeting where you don't get to say anything, but just listening. Of course, there's no empowerment, right? So engagement is like the first step. People start to take you seriously. Maybe start to ask you questions. Maybe start to to your comments, right? Well, is better than having saying nothing. And above that is alteration, whether actual changes and solutions were made in a decision-making process. And that matters because if there's any immediate decisions can be made during the meeting, that means something has been changed. So that's a good signal, which leads to the fourth dimension, concession, whether the power is actually transferred from the government or the power holder to shape and make decisions for the public. So these four dimensions work in a cascading scale of how much power is being given to citizens. And each dimension is further evaluated based on three criteria. De jure empowerment means power allocated by political institutions and power holders, and sometimes institutions are de facto required, maybe by the law, to do so. Also, de facto empowerment, the actual power gained by citizens under given institutional framework. And spontaneous empowerment, if the institution is open to conceding power and empowering citizens. This three also is on the cascading scale. De jure means that, okay, this is a mandatory process. There's nothing spontaneous in this process, right? Their power holders are required to do so. De facto means that we're looking through the perspective of the citizens, whether power are actually given to the citizens. So this is the end outcome. Spontaneous means that whether the power holders actually take initiative of giving up power. This is like the ideal situation. So each of the three criteria is evaluated under the four dimensions because, for example, right, de jure involvement is different from de facto involvement because de jure involvement means that, okay, you have to involve people. But de facto empowerment means that, okay, people are actually involved. So there's a difference in it. So based on this three criteria and four dimensions of framework, we asked the large language model to evaluate each of the five dimensions and provide a score between 1 and 5, where 5 indicates higher procedural equity. Okay, here are the results. The table on the top right shows the score of the four dimensions. I think the trend is pretty apparent. Involvement and engagement score pretty good. Involvement even has pretty high score, pretty high distribution of score at 4. Engagement is doing generally well because the most of scores cluster around 3 and 4. Things start to become interesting when it goes to alteration because 2 and 3 become the cluster, and when it's at concession, so it's 1 and 2. So what does that tell you? It tells you that public meetings overall are doing pretty okay, acceptable for involvement and engagement. They're showing that at least now public meetings are beyond consultation and informing. But for alteration and concession, there's still rare cases of actual power shifts happening here. And that actually, this trend, this pattern actually aligns with our hypothesis that the more power transfer required to the citizens, the less likely it's going to happen. But is that the end of it? Let's look, maybe not. Let's look at the correlation matrix on the bottom. So It's a, well, anyway, so the line graph on the left is basically showing similar things with the table on the top. It's showing that involvement and engagement across the time between 2013 and 2022. So because 20 and 2023, actually 2023 is cropped out here. Why 2013? Because before 2013, data was disproportionately data set is disproportionately smaller, which can create a skew. So we did not include that. We started from 2013 for the plotting of the graph. And we see that across this 10 years, involvement engagements has largely been pretty much aligned, overlapping. And then the score of alteration is generally lower than that, than involvement and engagement. And then the score for concession has been consistently low. And you also see a very interesting trend that scores are mostly higher between 2013 and 2016, and it decreases to 2021. For involvement and engagement, it started to rise and for alterations throughout, but not so much for concession. So we speculate that there might be something happening, especially during the COVID years, but we don't know. So we can only hypothesize. We cannot prove that. But that's an interesting trend we observe here. And on top of that is the correlation matrix. So we see that alteration turns out to be most not to be most the correlation the correlation is higher for alteration to involvement, engagement, and concession. So we also from this matrix we hypothesize that maybe alteration could be a solution for the low power, low empowerment for citizens in parliament meeting, because think about it, in the meetings, if actual decisions or actual changes are being made, that signifies that some certain level of power is being transferred from the power holders to the citizens, right? You need to have involvement and engagement to get enough hearing and information to lead to a decision, to an alteration. And once you have an alteration, there you also sometimes require a concession to do that. So we're not saying that alteration necessarily leads to concession, because when concession happen, there might be alteration, because alteration is like a premise for concession. But this is correlation study, so we cannot claim a causal relationship in this. But overall, this is a quite interesting pattern to deliver. Beyond that, we also did topic clustering from the transcripts. So we divide the projects in the transcripts into housing, public facilities, transit infrastructure, retail, commercial, and miscellaneous. And the N means how many projects are identified from the 4,000 public meeting transcripts. And we also cluster the topics of concerns into property conflict, development conflict, resource conflict. I'm not showing that here, but this is derived from a paper published by Campbell in 2016 in JAPA. It's basically saying that in planning decision making, there's always conflicts revolving economic development, equity, and environmental protection. And for those topics, there's always property, development, and resource conflict involved. So that's how we cluster those topics. But it's funny because that categorization does not work that well for our public meeting transcript projects, because most of them, 80%, were categorized as miscellaneous. We also cluster institutions involved. So we have 50,000 institutions involved in this. Among them, the large body is government agency. Of course, it's planning meetings. We also have real estate and property management companies, professional service companies, civic organizations, and some miscellaneous. And we are drawing correlations under each of the columns. So the first correlation is project types. We're drawing correlations between project types and the scores of the 4 dimensions. And well, it's actually unsurprising to see that housing and residential are like positively correlated with all the four dimensions, whereas public facilities are associated with two, and retail and commercial with two, but not so much with transit systems and infrastructures. So that means that for local public meetings involving project types, it's easier for housing, for all for project types except transit systems and infrastructure to get certain levels of citizen empowerment. So that tells us something about transit and infrastructure projects, which is a caveat I'm going to revisit later. And for topics of concern, we see that property conflict is more associated, significantly associated with involvement. Development conflict is associated with involvement and engagement. Sorry, and property conflict is also with negatively with alteration. And then resource conflict is negatively associated with concession. Well, this is interesting, but it's a little controversial. First of all, 80% of those data were actually miscellaneous. We only have 20% of the data, which means that compared to the statistical sample of all the data set, it may be skewed. But within this data set, we see that at least resource conflict is less likely to give citizen empowerment. Right? The more likely the meetings and resource conflict, the less likely that citizens are empowered in this process. And in property conflict, whenever it involves private ownership, property change, all that kind of things, it's likely to involve people, but it's less likely to provide a solution. Compared to development conflict, it's easier to get involvement and engagement, but not so much about alterations and concession. So you see, when we see different conflicts, when conflicts emerge in local public meetings, not unsurprisingly actually, that there are not actual alterations and concessions happening in the conflicts. Because what does conflict mean? Conflict means that there are power holders, there are third-party actors, and there are citizens. They might have differentiated interests. And we see at least in this correlation study, that citizens are less likely to be empowered in the negotiation of interest. And who may be more powerful in this process? It could be the corporations, it could be the government, but certainly not so much for the citizens. And if we look at the institutions involved, if it's government agency, wow, it just aligns with our hypothesis perfectly. Government agency tend to exhibit involvement of the public, but not anything beyond. If it's real estate or property management companies, oh yeah, they don't like the public. So that's why it's negatively correlated with alteration and concession, because they want to make the power. They want to uphold the power and make the decisions. And for professional service companies, for example, architects, right? It's not changing anything because who cares about architects' thoughts in the planning meetings? Architects work for real estate and the property management companies or the government. But some like being shared here is civic organizations. When there are civic organizations, it's positively correlated with involvement, engagement, alterations, and concession. That shows us some promising aspects of having civic organizations to increase citizen participation and citizen empowerment. So to sum up from the results from the study, so the overarching conclusion is that public meetings do not consistently result in pragmatic solutions or citizen empowerment because structural barriers exist. For housing and residential public facilities, retail and commercial projects, citizens are a little more likely to be considered as stakeholders. But for transit system and infrastructure, there's a structural barrier here because decisions are already usually predetermined at the Fed or regional level because these are the entities who actually make the decisions. For example, when you do infrastructure project in the United States, you need eminent domain. It's like land expropriation. These are like state crafts. that people can just not fight against. So even though there are public meetings talking about those projects, it's most likely to be informing and tokenism because, well, yeah, good to hear you don't like this project. So off you go. That's basically it. And also, equity and social justice have remained at the heart of decision-making processes. So because property conflict and development conflict tend to involve and engage citizens, whereas resource conflict shows certain reluctance to power redistribution. So that means although the property conflict and development conflict has been achieving certain improvements, but we still need to know that resource conflict is doing very poor. And why resource conflict is doing poor? Because resource involves natural resource protections. And again, who has a say in the natural resource allocation process? It's still the state, probably the Fed or regional level, because when certain decisions involves resources and materials that is beyond the neighborhood scale, it's going to be a regional planning decision making. Now, who does regional planning decision making? It's going to be the government. It's going to be the regional, it's going to be the Fed governments who don't have the time or the effort to listen to the voice of the vast majority of the public. So that tells us the structural barriers in this process. And is this so abysmal that nothing good can happen from it? Yeah, well, we still have some promising aspects from the studies. First, meetings around problem solving can create opportunities for responsive and participatory outcomes. For example, co-production of public services involving communities, minorities, the government, and NGOs from the very beginning could be a solution. Because whenever there is an actual solution being made and change in the status quo, there will be citizen empowerment in this process. And beyond that, civic organizations could reshape power dynamics in local public meetings because, first, local government agencies, they don't care. They do not necessarily lead to substantial citizen empowerment because it's the state. What they do is to control. Why are they relinquishing their power? So not so much hope for that. For profit-driven and interest groups, what they care is money, right? They don't care about the public. In fact, public are like the boulders in the road for them to get money. So yeah, they often impede the provision of solutions and the redistribution of power. So naturally, it's the civic organizations who can actually help to voice, to organize, to formulate power coalitions, to transition from power over to power with. Okay, so from this project, we were thinking that, all right, so it's so hard for certain stakeholders and institutions to concede the power. But are there cases where this kind of decision-making process is highly contested, that some kind of decisions are actually being actively made, and which make the process more juicy? So reflecting from this publication, we were thinking about the second project, right? It's still revolving power through text, but we're looking at a specific kind of planning practice, zoning variance. So for those of you who are not familiar with the zoning context in the United States, so zoning determines certain land use, what can be done on the piece of land and how much can be done. For example, how many floors can build on the land. But we know that things change, society change, social structures change, and the environment changes. So there'll be changes to be made on the zoning laws to allow new things to happen. So how are those changes made? It's done through zoning variance. It's a formal exception to land use rules and discretionary and contested planning actions. So this is like a pitching in zoning variance. So if you want to petition for a change, you need to solicit your materials. You need to solicit your supporting stakeholders. You need to form a coalition. You go to a public meeting. You talk. Your friends talk. You show the documents. you appeal to the local zoning board. And the local zoning board will also source their documents to source your counterparts, your friends' counterparts, to say why this should not happen. So essentially, this is like a Greek and Roman forum where people debate. Of course, laws are there. Laws have certain technical considerations, but technicality is not like the full image of zoning regulations. There are certain spaces for this kind of negotiations to happen, and that's exactly what zoning variance is about. And that's why we think this is a very juicy topic, because it actually has a lot more contestative cases, right, in zoning variances. And again, they happen in local public meetings because local public meetings are the venues for those kind of public affair discussions to happen. These are venues where rules, power, and emotions interact. So our question is that how do stakeholder configurations, and emotional expressions shape zoning variance outcomes? Because a lot of studies have been done on zoning variance outcomes, but not many people have studied first, who changes the outcomes? And first, who changes the outcomes? And second, through what instruments are those outcomes changes? So based on that, we're looking at stakeholder configuration, basically means who, and emotional expressions, basically means one of the instruments, but yet a powerful instrument to shape zoning variance outcomes. So for stakeholders, zoning variance hearings are arenas where developers, residents, and officials negotiate exceptions of the zoning regulations. And just to give you an example of it, developers, they're like institutional entrepreneurs. They want flexibility from the zoning regulation because they are always driven by higher land value. What about homeowners? Homeowners want to defend neighborhood characters, and sometimes they can do this through exclusionary actions. For example, I don't know if you heard about NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So essentially, like cities like in Boston or Cambridge, right, where New Englandish is new density, some residents will just don't like densification. They would just resist any decisions about densify their neighborhoods, and they voice themselves in public meetings, right? Well, on the one hand, yes, they have the de facto right to keep how their neighborhood is like, but on the other hand, by keeping out density projects, housing supply will become a problem. When housing supply become a problem, it's harder for newcomers, young people, right, working professionals to buy homes or even rent. That's exactly a problem that Boston is facing. Housing supply is at its shortage, and because a lot of this kind of homeowners are like they dislike densification around their neighborhoods. And what about professional actors? For example, attorneys, planning staff, and planning boards, they exercise procedural authority and they translate emotion and conflict into technical reasoning. Because in planning decision making, traditionally, technical language has been valued. Any kind of emotional expressions have been deemed as the noise. Because this is, the planning is such a Western concept that is derived from the Enlightenment movement. So everything has to be rational. But people often forget that when decisions are made, when decisions are entrenched into neighborhoods, it will piss people off. When people are pissed off, they will voice with emotions, either happy, sad, angry. And these are natural expressions of human beings. But yet they are certainly deemed as technical. So those professional actors, for most of the cases, they serve as the intermediary, right, to translate those emotions into this technical language that can be deciphered by planning officers. So for stakeholders, there's a hierarchy of influence that decides outcomes more than the written rules. So what about emotions? Emotions are essentially effective decision making, right? So because public meetings are as I said, emotionally charged. They're not purely rational debates. Naturally, anger, sadness, and disgust will emerge as as instruments that signal fairness, loss, and legitimacy. And planners and officials will perform emotional restraint to uphold this certain neutrality in this process. And residents will also express civic emotion to assert belonging and moral authority. And so emotions operates as the procedural resource that mediates conflicts and legitimizes decisions. So after that bunch of theory, now we look at the data method. Same data set is from the local views because it's a continuation of the last project. And from that 6,000 transcripts, we identified, if I remember correctly, more than 10,000 projects on 10,000 projects on zoning. And through those projects, we use language model to filter out 2,000 zoning variance cases. We did iterative process in this because we're using ChatGPT 4.0 model for this. And of course, we are not training our own model. So we did not feed a large amount of data in that. And also, it's very effective in image detection, but for textual, we just don't have a solid database that contains zoning variance cases. So instead of doing training, we were doing prompts refinement. So essentially, we started by feeding ChatGPT model with the American Planning Association definition of what zoning variance is about. And the first round of experiment was pretty poor. The model get a lot of things messed up. When people talk about zoning, it's also counted as zoning variance, even though it's not about zoning variance. So we added a bunch of conditions into the prompts. And eventually, and we also validate by human power. So got me and research assistant every time the one round of experiment is done, we extract 100 in total randomized projects, and we verify whether ChatGPT's decision was correct. And if it's correct, that's good. If not correct, we have to refine the prompt. So we have gone through rounds of rounds, and until eventually our accuracy reached over 95%. So we are confident to proceed to the next step with the 2,000 zoning variance cases. So it's still zero-shot prompting plus manual validation. And because we're doing emotional analysis, we used the very classic Ekman's version of seven basic emotions: anger, sadness, disgust, fear, joy, surprise, and neutral. And why we're using that? Because this Ekman's piece has a very good articulation of what each emotions is. So we can just use that description to feed into the to the model, so the model can understand what exactly are we looking for. Okay, so some results. Let's start from the patterns. So this is the pattern of zoning variance decisions. We see that from the overall pattern that zoning variance is not rare, right? It's actually tools being constantly used for making adjustments of the existing regulatory laws. And among those zoning variance projects, 77 are area variances, meaning can I build beyond a certain line? Can I build more? Can I build taller? So these are more routine and more flexible decisions in zoning variance compared to use variances, meaning that, okay, can I change the land use? That's tricky, right? Because if you kind of change the land use, well, that would be a lot of things being associated as the consequences, right? For example, if you want to change your residential use into a commercial use, that means it's likely a lot of people are going to be visiting your lot. And that's going to create a lot of problems for your neighborhood. And of course, that will be open for stricter scrutiny. And for all the zoning variance cases, 67 have been approved. 23 are impending, and only 7%, surprisingly, have been denied. again reinforcing the statement that zoning variance has been, actively exercised to make adjustments. And there is also a temporal trend that the variance actively rose sharply after 2015, peaked around 2021. We guess that this is because it's during the COVID housing pressure, because everybody was doing something about housing estates. So more likely that there are more zoning variance petitions being filed during that time, which kind of also correlated to what we saw just now about the overall trend of the four dimensions of citizen empowerment in local public meetings. And let's look at the stakeholder configurations. So for resistors, they're present in about around 80% of denied cases, but only in 12% of all the approved ones. So this graph may take a little time to look, but this is the total project counts. These are granted, denied, and pending. So in the denied projects, resistors dominate in the stakeholders, whereas third parties are not so much. In the granted projects, of course, the percentage of resistors is smaller. And then for the pending projects, it's kind of, somewhere there in the middle. And for granted projects within for example, and this graph is like a call out of the colored ones from light blue bars. So for granted projects, we're looking at this 170 and 275. Among them, so there are professional resistors is half, and for third party in favor is more than half. That explains, right? Because you need third party in favors to support a project, or despite the fact that for granted projects, they didn't really matter that much. But let's look at denied. Denied is very interesting. So for the denied projects, among those 135 cases, among the 135 cases of resistors presence, which is dominant, professional resistors are dominant in the resistors, whereas third-party oppose is dominant in the smaller chunk of third-party players. So that tells you that professional resistors, for example, attorneys, planners, HOAs, they dominate the denied cases. And non-professional resistors, for example, neighbors, residents, are more common in approved cases because they have limited leverage. And for third-party actors, specifically advocacy organizations, civic groups, they legitimize approvals through moral and institutional endorsements. So zoning variance is co-produced decisions shaped by coalition strength, not just legal criteria. And this, you don't have to you don't have to read this graph to show you, but I got this crux extracted from the graph here. So it is basically showing the composition of emotions in the practice. So non-neutral affects, for example, anger, sadness, and disgust, they dominate contested cases, meaning that when there are interest conflicts, there will be emotions. Neutral is more related with approvals. That's not surprising because you go through the process with, it's going to be neutrality. But when things are being denied, it's going to be anger and disgust. That's also not surprising because whoever files the petition will be angry if the petition is denied. And whoever is in favor, for example, third party, will be, surprising, it will feel disgusted by the decisions of denials. And a surprising finding is that we hypothesized that anger is going to be dominant, but actually sadness is also dominant in denials. And why is that? I'm going to talk about sadness a little later. And for professionals, they restrain anger and disgust to reinforce these procedural authorities. For residents, they use sadness or grief to assert belongings and fairness. And emotions are instruments of legitimacy. They stabilize discretion and mediates conflicts. So here, we extracted kind of a couple of quotations from highly contested cases. So here we are highlighting the emotion associated with their quotes. This is a professional resistor to a request. So to a requester, and the expression is anger. So this professional resistor is using anger to set certain procedural borders, meaning that, so for example, you'd better don't do that. If we spot that, you're going to be in trouble. So these are more like threats in anger, but this is like border setting. And this is professional resistor to the third party in favor, and that's disgust, right? It's almost like sarcastically saying, oh, of course you know what you're doing. You don't have to pretend. We know you are insidious, blah, blah, blah. So that's a disgust. And this is a non-professional resistor to a requester for statness for a denied project. So they've done a magnificent job fixing up the houses, blah, 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 blah. But here, what the non-professional resistor is doing is that it's using sadness for sympathetic gestures, right? It's trying to use emotion to build a bridge between the person and the institutions and the institution who makes the decisions. And here is a professional resistor to a requester. It's also using sadness as an instrument. It's always disappointing to see good people end up blah 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 blah, right? Just say, okay, I'm being a sympathetic, although this is not happening, but I feel it, I hear it. Let's repair the relationship. So these are very interesting examples that the large language model identified from the transcripts. So for stakeholders in zoning variances, variances are co-produced for sure. They are not just technical adjudications. And discretion is a site where technicality or rules meets power, right? It reflects whose knowledge and voices are being counted. And for emotional dynamics, emotions is a governance technology that stabilizes discretion. Because when you make decisions, you use emotion as the technology to justify your decision and your thinking process, your rationale. And emotion also bridges the technical judgment and moral legitimacy in decision making. So from this study, overall, the conclusion is that discretion is negotiated, it's not neutral, it's shaped by coalitions, expertise, and advocacy. Discretion is also emotional because every technical decision involves feelings, judgment, and trust. And these have implications for the planning field. That's instead of just treating emotions as noises. We planners should have an alternative perspective towards emotions, to see that as governance technologies, to see that as natural expressions of thoughts of residents. So in the future, I think maybe planning school should have a class called sympathetic planning to teach planners to understand emotions and to work and live with emotions. Okay, so I think we're pretty much on time. I've discussed these two projects as cases of applying a large language model in reading textual materials for research. And then let's go back to the very starting point. What is urban and what is urban made of? From the two projects, I want to show that the urban is not only built in the space, it is also written into existence, meaning that text also represents cities, also represents the urban process, and is actually a very powerful and precious resources. So the next question is, beyond the research questions I asked from the two projects, the next question is, who reads and who decides how they are read? I think that's a question for all of us who are applying technology, applying AI, applying large language models in research, as of thinking the equitable aspects of who, whom, and for whom. Okay, so that concludes my talk, and I'm gonna open it up for questions and discussions. And I also want to acknowledge that the projects are supported by the Body Center of Law and Social Policy at University of Buffalo. Thank you all. Okay, how is that gonna be done? Fred, are you gonna pick your students for Q&A or how how's that work?
No, I
Oh,
think
do you have Q&A?
we will have some questions, I believe. Um, we had a lot of questions last session, so I think I think I can start off like just and then also very thank you very much for giving this lecture, and it's quite I mean it's very interesting to see like how you use like large language models on like new possibilities for uh, analyzing this kind of large scale planning participatory data. I mean, which is usually like difficult to study like systematically. And but in this process, I wanted to ask like, was there anything that you found that from this framework that you pursued, if there's any parties that has the most power in
Yeah,
yeah
it's
like yeah
yeah.
from the yeah.
Thank you, Fred. That's an interesting question because this is definitely based in the context of the United States. So, United States is different from Singapore, right? In the United States, uh, it's a very neoliberal society. I'm not saying Singapore is not, but the United States is a very neoliberal society. So from 50 years ago, there has been scholars warning us about growth coalition. Basically, John Logan and Mao talk. They were talking about how the government and the market actors, specifically corporations and companies who are interested in creating revenue from land value appreciation, will form powerful coalitions to shape planning decisions making. And I think this is still the case. In this study, we find that the government, whoever has the power of holding those public meetings, will still have the majority power in this process because well, for example, they are the ones who provide the venues. How are you going to imagine they relinquish the power because they de facto own the venue? So it's very hard for them to relinquish the power, and they are de facto in power. And aside of that, developers are also very powerful, right? Because first of all, developers are politically savvy because developers are not like only one or two person. It's a company. In a company, there will be PR people, public relations. What they do is to have a good relationship with local board members, with local elites, so that when they want to do a development, when they step into a public meeting, there will always be people in favor of them. So, see, power is a relational construct. And from the results we see now, we see that uh, the government and the developers are in power. But this is also a relational process because they are actively building power. They're building power with each other because they are politically savvy. They know what's going on. What about normal residents? Yeah, if for example a political science university professor is living in this neighborhood, yeah, this person knows what's going on. This person will also actively build relationships and resistance, which is actually a case in Buffalo. In our department, there's a professor who is a advocacy planner, and his site is in East Buffalo. He has very good relationships with the East Side neighborhoods to form resistance coalitions. You need this kind of savvy person to work through the system. But what about the vast majority of people who are just like normal residents? They don't know anything about political science. They can't even figure themselves out through this kind of public hearing systems. Sometimes they don't even go to those meetings. Okay? Of course, they're depowered. But then, why they're depowered? because there's a structural barrier in this process because the power holders are just like intentionally do not want to give up power. So yeah, short answer, government and developers. Long answer, it's a relational power building process. I know, like, I don't know if my talk is kind of an outlier because I think the other presenters are more like design architecture focused. Mine's like a planning focused. So when we talk about planning, it's a lot about process, equity, power, all kind of things. Sometimes those concepts may be a little alien from some of the core questions in architecture education. But well, I think there are aspects can be drawn from which can be drawn correlations to what you guys study, right? Because in architectural practice, essentially, if you want to, so architecture can serve for the people or it can serve for the capital. So if you want to build an equitable, for example, if you want to design an equitable public space, eventually you want to know what people think and what people do about certain typologies of spaces. And then eventually you want to understand this kind of association through their expressions and thus through textual materials. Right? So if you want to create, for example, the commons, right, the public spaces, a nice public space, it's not just about how nice it looks. It's also about whether it can actually be accessed by a variety of different people. And even how people think about the space is expressed through text. So although you might be asking a different set of research questions, but the similar kind of techniques can be duplicated. Okay, any other questions?
Do we have questions from the classroom?
Hello.
Oh,
Thank you. Is the audio okay? Can
yeah, I
you?
can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I really like how you frame urban planning as a system that operates through text and discourse. I have two questions. The first one is I'm curious about how like the limits of analyzing all these public meetings through transcripts because very often the planning negotiations and some power dynamics happen informally outside of these public meetings. So how do we counter for this like off-record interactions when we're using AI to evaluate participation? And the second question is maybe on the second project, I'm curious whether like spatial setting or like the formality of the setting might influence the emotions of the participants. Thank you.
Thank you. Love that. Great questions. Great questions. I'm not being polite. Actually, great questions. So on your first question, the limitation of the study. So essentially, from the technical aspects, there are two limitations unavoidably. First is data availability, whether you can get enough data out of it. For example, I already acknowledged that we don't have data of New York City public meetings, which is like the most juicy piece, I think, for this kind of research. New York City is crazy. So, public meetings in New York City will also be crazy. I interned at the Manhattan Bureau, Department of Urban Planning for a summer, and I went to a public meeting. Man, that was intense. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure if that kind of public meetings are recorded in YouTube and can be transcribed into textual materials, I believe a lot of things can be found out. But the city chose not to disclose it for certain kind of reasons. I can understand, I can guess, but it's just a pity. And the second limitation is technicality of those documents. Why I'm using public meeting transcripts as the starting point? Because these are essentially conversations. There has been a batch of research being published in flagship urban planning journals in North America. And most of them are studying technical plans or planning documents. For example, hazard rescue plans or economic development plans, etc. Good things about those plans are these are very planning related. Right? These are directly talking about how planning decisions are made and what kind of planning decisions are made. Just like that picture I attached in one of the slides showing Atlanta's Planning Commission documents. But the other side of those documents is that these are planning documents. They have terminologies, they have technical jargons, meaning that do we have a large language model that can fully decipher all those technicalities or the connotations of planning? We have ChatGPT, we have Claude, we have Gork, but we don't have like a planning GPT, right? We haven't trained a model specifically tailored to do those jobs. And actually, that's the reason why those research are being published, because they identify like 60 or 100 technical planning documents. They use the large language model to study those plans, and then they manually validate those plans with student assistants to see how the performance of the large language models. Because planning is essentially a applied social science, so people care about the usability of the research. So essentially, people looking at so the human validation shows that the GPT model still sucks at reading the technical plans. So yay, planners are still useful, right? Quite happy. But again, that's a limitation from a technical aspect. And a third limitation, which I observed from doing this research, specifically on my research, is validation. So here's the interesting dilemma. Think about it. If the whole point of having AI is to do the jobs that humans cannot do. But for scientific purposes, when you do something, use AI to do something that human cannot do, you have to validate it. But then if it cannot be done by human, how can you manually validate it? That's a dilemma that I ran into. I ran 6,000 transcripts. And how do I validate it? Right? I mean, am I just like 100% relying on ChatGPT's performance and not knowing that it might have secretively hallucinated a couple times? But to be fair, right, if you want me to like validate 6,000 transcripts, I cannot. I might as well just like toss out $10,000 and recruit students and just read all the plans from the beginning, right? So that's also a predicament in this kind of research. So it's a little hard. To be honest, like it really depends on how well you can justify it, and that's why a lot of research are being phrased as exploratory, right? Just to like downplay the usability of it, because yeah, in fact, it's very hard to manually validate. So that's the three limitations I can tell you. And that's a great question about the spatial setting. I don't know. To answer this question, we need to first do image detection of the original YouTube recordings. And second, pair those image detection with the transcripts. It can be done, but it takes a lot of effort to be done. And to be honest, I doubt about whether the spatial setting affects it. But it might have some kind of changes in this, but I think the process matters more than the spatial setting. Now, of course, how you arrange your supporters to see, how you position the planning board and the residents, and how they are sitting. Are they sitting behind somebody or are they sitting face to face? Will have some kind of change it. My hypothesis from my experience in planning hearings is that it doesn't change that much, because usually what happens is people just argue all the time. So it's like a market. People just argue all the time. But it can be done. But well, I'm just thinking that the investment of doing this compared to the actual findings is a little disproportionate. But that's a very good question. When we are doing this research, we also thought about it, but we just choose to not to do it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. It's really eye-opening, and I noticed you mainly use a large language model to analyze what happened after the meetings. And I was wondering, could they potentially be used during the meetings themselves, maybe for the future, to shape how public engagement And also, like helping the residents to understand all the technical language in the real time. Do you think the direction is worth to explore?
Okay, so let me rephrase your question. So you're asking what kind of future measures can be done to improve citizen empowerment in public meetings? Is that your question?
Yeah, with the help of large language model.
Okay. Yeah, certainly. So there is a professor. What's her first name? I forgot. Her last name. I actually cited her in the lecture. Her last name is Einstein. Crazy, but it's not that Einstein. She is a professor at Northeastern University. She actually wrote a paper published in Journal of Urban Affairs I think in 2021. She was talking about how public meetings were taking place on Zoom during the COVID time. But that's promising, right? That sounds promising because it certainly increases participation. Because for whoever may have accessibility problems to public meeting venues can also be part of it. But still, the findings show that it does not change so much of the process. Because even though people can hop on meetings online, the structural power inequality still exists. What technology does is that it amplifies certain characteristics of people. If you're savvy, technology allows you to be more savvy. You can use ChatGPT to shape your text or to shape your conversation, right? So it's more convincing, it's more empathetic. But if you do not know what people want to hear in the public meetings, or if you do not know how to make a good relationship with those who make decisions, doesn't matter whether you have ChatGPT or Claude or whatsoever. It's not gonna help you. But it's not all of it. I think it increases citizen empowerment, like overall on the overall level. Because if you just ask ChatGPT, for example, how can I make the planning board to favor more argument more? And followed by your question, be like, I want to build a butcher shop in my backyard. ChatGPT is going to tell you, right? Because ChatGPT or like large language model essentially learns from whatsoever is out there online. Whatever data is out there online, it learns from it and it tells you what's the more likely possibility of things to win the case. So it might likely to tell you, okay, here are the options for you to do. And it will help you to become more savvy. But it doesn't mean you are the most savvy one because everybody else can do the same thing. When everybody becomes savvier, if you do not know how the system works, you're still in a disadvantage. So you see how I'm answering your question? If you ask me how AI and, for example, large language model can help citizen empowerment, I say overall, it does. But it does not change the structural inequality among the various populations. And it's further compounded by digital literacy. Because if everyone else is using AI to help them to come up with the answer, and for people who do not know and do not use AI, if they were originally in a disadvantaged position, this difference is going to be exacerbated when everybody is becoming more savvier, right? So the result is mixed from adopting AI technologies in those decision-making processes. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mom. Anyone else?
These are great questions.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. I think I also have a question. Maybe partially you answered a bit of this already from the previous question, but do you have any thoughts on like what are the biggest limitations of your methodology of like using all the ChatGPT and how you will like change it or improve on it for your future research? Because just now you mentioned quite a bit about the manual validation process. So to me, that sounds like one of the big aspects, but yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to iterate myself, unfortunately. The biggest limitation is the validation process. Because I think like for anyone who is using large language model for doing research, you have to validate the results. And especially academia, if you want to publish your research in academic publication or in academic outlets, reviewers are going to be asking you, how are you sure that your results are reliable? And that's why there's a batch of what I said, research on comparing human performance and AI performance on reading technical plans. Because essentially what they're doing is first, the data sample is small. It can be done by people, it can be done by human. It's almost like a pilot study. And then on this pilot study, that's the second point. They're trying to find out what's the difference between AI agent and human. So once they understand those differences between large language model and between AI and human, the differences could be expected to be scaled up if we start to adopt those technologies at a scale. But it has its valid points for those kind of studies, and it's feasible. But for my kind of research, I just have to frame it as exploratory, because validation is essentially a problem. In my research, I said, okay, I use manual validation randomly, but like with this large volume of data, I can only randomly validate 10% of it. But is 10% like at the threshold of making the results reliable? We don't know. We actually don't know, because within there's a huge heterogeneity among the text materials within this data set. So I mean, we just have to find ways to say that, okay, we have validated it through certain manners. Like for the second research, we validated, we in the methodology, we decompose the process into specific shorter executable phases, and we validate in each phase. But there are still things we cannot validate. For example, extracting emotions from those textual materials. The whole point of me doing this research is that I don't want to do it. Someone else has to do it. The AI has to do it for me. And why am I going back just validate all of them for the sake of just make it reliable? But I understand it has to be reliable. So I'm still trying to figure out a plausible way of making that academically and practically acceptable. But yeah, so the biggest limitation is still validation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it's about time already.
Okay.
Okay, anything else?
Fred, you want to say something, or good to go?
Thank you, Maxwell. Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Professor Kim, for the invitation again. And thank you, everyone, for listening to my lecture. And thank you, students, for the wonderful questions. And you have my name, and you can search my profile. If you have any questions or want to follow up, just feel free to shoot me an email. Right? Happy to chat anytime. Right? Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Night.
Bye bye.